They sold her under lantern light, a pregnant girl, traded like cattle by the man who called himself her father. The crowd laughed months until one quiet stranger raised his hand. A lumberjack. Alone, scarred, carrying more ghosts than words. What no one knew that night was, he wasn't buying a woman. He was buying a second chance. And starting a war that would burn through every lie this town ever told. The rope creaked, as if it had a voice whispering its rough promise against chapped wrists. Lantern light swung on iron hooks under the livery's roof, casting honey-yellow circles that made the dust look like drifting snow. Boots crunched. Men murmured. A bell was struck with a branding iron, and the sound rang thin and cruel. They had set the girl on a hay bale like she was a saddle to be inspected. 22, with straw-blonde hair braided to keep it out of her face, and a small swell beneath her faded calico dress that needed no telling. Her eyes were sky-bright and bruised at the corners. The town called her Eliza Hart, only the man selling her called her his, and the word soured the air. Indenture, drawled the auctioneer, chewing tobacco until his lips looked like rust. Debt to be paid and a mouth to feed. She's with child. Who'll take on the trouble? And the coin owed to Cyrus Bledsoe. Cyrus stood behind the girl like a shadow too long for the man casting it. Late 40s, lanky as a fence post, black frock coat that hid a whiskey gut. He had preacher's hair and gambler's eyes. One hand to the lantern's post, the other tapped his thigh where a thin switch hung like a pet snake. The girl flinched whenever he moved, as if the air between them held a memory no one present wanted to witness. From the back, a man who didn't belong to crowds shifted his weight. Amos Reed, 41, shoulders like a felled pine, beard peppered with the first winter. A lumberjack from up in the Gallatin woods, sleeves rolled to forearms that knew axe handles better than court papers. He paid for things in sweat and in silence, and when he had to choose, he chose quiet. The scar across his knuckles, white as chalk, made a line under the lantern's sway. "Who'll start?" asked the auctioneer. A laugh broke the murmur, low, ugly, interested. The lantern hissed as a moth burned itself on the glass. Eliza kept her chin up and stared at the door. Even hope wanted a way out. 200, someone grunted. 210. 250. 300, said Amos Reed, and when he spoke, the barn-loft pigeons startled. He didn't blink when half the men turned to see who had put Flint to the room. Eliza's breath was a small caged thing. Cyrus Bledsoe's smile was a row of dull pennies. "Sold if no man has more courage than a log cutter," he said, tapping his switch against his boot. "Any other hero among you?" Boots shifted like snakes under leaves. No one answered. The bell rang again, sharp and metallic, and the rope sighed as Amos stepped forward with folded bills and a hard, steady gaze that said he was buying a problem and something else besides. But as the paper changed hands and the lantern swung wide, Cyrus leaned close to Eliza and whispered something that drained what little color she had left. The rope creaked again. The bell's echo died. And outside, under a moon thin as a shaving from a carpenter's plane, a second set of footsteps waited that didn't belong to Amos Reed at all. Why would a man sell what he swore to protect, and what secret could make a girl's eyes go from sky blue to storm dark in a single breath? Wind carried the smell of kerosene from a cracked lantern, and with it an old story. Men who believed ownership could be scribbled on paper and hammered into a soul with a nail of fear. Cyrus Bledsoe believed it twice over. He kept his black frock coat buttoned to the throat as if modesty were a cloak for his kind of sin. The stepfather, though no blood could prove it, and no God would bless it, had carved Eliza's life into ledgers. Indenture, he'd said to the crowd, but his eyes had wandered to the switch like a dog's to meat. Debt walks on two legs, friends, and eats for two. Laughter, scattered like brittle leaves. Eliza tried to carry herself like the girl she'd been before this, before her mother's grave, before the black-coated man in the kitchen, who called himself family, before dry seasons and empty barrels of flour, and the long winter of saying yes to survive. She could taste metal in her mouth. Fear always tasted like a bit on a runaway horse. Under her dress, her child rolled as if to say, "I'm here." Hold on, Cyrus's cruelty was never thunder. It was rain that never stopped. A tilt of the head that made a command. A hand on a shoulder that seemed gentle, until you noticed the bruises hid under the sleeve cuff. He would stand by the door when she tried to leave and smile, as if he'd invented the idea of locked hinges. When she slept, he'd stand at the foot of the bed with a lantern and study her face like he was memorizing a route back. She learned to keep her breath slow and even, to trick him into thinking he didn't haunt her. When Amos counted out the money, Cyrus pinched each bill at the corner as though testing fabric, feeling for strength for places to tear. "I'll bring her back when you're done," he said conversationally, with that smile that meant the opposite. "Debt like this don't wash clean." Amos ignored him. He took Eliza's arm like you take the reins of a skittish mare, slow, steady, nothing sudden. Up close, he saw she had a tiny silver scar at the corner of her mouth, like a comma where laughter should have been. 22, he guessed, with eyes that kept checking the door, then the windows, then the place where a shadow might move. A girl who had taught herself to map exits. The town breathed around them, saloon piano playing a tune that didn't care who bled, boots crunching over cinders, a dog scratching at fleas. Amos walked her to the street's edge, where his mule stood patient and judgmentless. He kept his voice low, the way you talk to trees on a windy day. "Name's Amos Reed. I got a cabin up where the river splits. You're coming with me, not because I believe in ownership, because I don't." Eliza looked at him like you look at a gate that might be open. "He'll come," she said. "He always comes. He says there's two debts, mine and the other." "The other?" She swallowed. The lantern by the livery hissed and guttered, a tiny blue flame dancing at its wick. "He says the child owes him his name." Behind them, Cyrus's boots made a slow rhythm on the livery's threshold. Tap, tap. The switch kissed his leg with each step, like a snake flirting with poison. "Enjoy the night air," he called. "The morning's colder than you think." Eliza's fingers trembled where they gripped the mule's reins, and in the distance, above the dark line of the pines, a wolf gave a single cracked voice howl, as if warning the valley that hunting season had turned to war. When a man claims even an unborn child as a ledger entry, what law or God will stop him when the lanterns go out? Amos Reed's cabin sat at the bend of the Glacier River, where the water bit the stones hard enough to polish them into a soldier's buttons. The place smelled of pine shavings and wood smoke, coffee grounds and linseed oil. He had built the porch wide, not for sitting but for drying ropes and lashing logs. The rafters held hooks big enough to hang quarters of elk, and a single lantern hung from a peg above the door, its light steady as a heartbeat. He gave Eliza the bed and took the chair by the stove. When she protested, he said only, "Chair has kept me alive through worse winters." He set his axe within reach, the ash handle smooth as river-worn bone. He brewed coffee and slid a tin cup toward her with a piece of sugar he pretended he didn't save all week for himself. Eliza's hair, braided neat now, caught in the lantern's light like wheat in late August. Her face delicate, high cheekbones, a chin that wanted to be stubborn but had been taught better, a blue ribbon around her wrist frayed to threads. "My mother's," she said when she saw him looking. She said a ribbon's a promise. "To yourself." Amos nodded once. He carried his own promises like extra weight on his belt, a brass wedding ring he kept in a drawer, too cold to wear and too heavy to throw away, a Bible with a page marked by a pine needle, a scar at his knuckles from the night he'd failed to hold a friend back from the edge of a winter river. He'd lost a wife 5 years before, fever, and with her a daughter who lived only long enough to break his heart open. Since then, he had spoken to trees and rivers more easily than to people. But some codes survive grief. Protect the small, defy the cruel. Past midnight, the river's voice grew louder, as if the water knew secrets and had chosen this hour to tell them. The boards of the porch answered with low, complaining whispers. Rope creaked, just a sway in the cold, nothing else. Then faint but deliberate, boots on snow-hardened dirt, crunch, 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 stopping where the lantern light thinned to grey. Amos stood. The chair did not squeal. He motioned Eliza to the bedroom and handed her a double-barrel shotgun with the care you give a newborn. "If the door opens, aim at knees," he said. "Legs don't lie." The knock was polite. 2 beats, then a third, like a man keeping time with a metronome only he could hear. "Neighborly call," came Cyrus Bledsoe's voice through the door, oily as if he'd greased it with charm. "You've got something of mine, Reed." Amos opened the door not more than the width of 2 fingers. The lantern threw long lines across Cyrus's face, carving his cheeks into sharp planes. His snake eyes narrower now, calculating. Behind him stood 2 men, one with a lazy right eyelid and a holster too low, the other built like a barrel and trying to look less tired than he felt. They had horses tied to the cottonwood at the yard's edge, where the river noise swallowed everything but the creak of leather. "You sold an indenture," Amos said, voice low. "You've been paid." Cyrus smiled as if someone had told a joke he didn't get but wanted to take credit for. "Papers for towns. Family ain't ink." He lifted a hand and the man with the lazy eyelid thumbed his holster. The lantern hissed. Snow flurries fine as sawdust swirled in the doorway. "Go," Amos said. "No harm comes through this door." "Everything comes through a door," Cyrus answered. "Sooner or later." Eliza, in the bedroom's dark, pressed both hands to the curve of her belly. The child moved, a flutter like a fish in a net. She looked at the shotgun, at the door, at the ribbon on her wrist, and squeezed her eyes shut against a memory that tasted like iron and thunder. Outside, Cyrus tapped his switch once against the porch rail, and wood answered wood with a dry little cry. When a man knocks with threats tucked behind his teeth, who decides whether the door becomes a shield or a coffin? Dawn came grey as a soldier's uniform. The river wore a scarf of steam. Amos stepped out to the yard, while Eliza watched from the bedroom window through a slit in the curtain. Cyrus and his two men stood by the cottonwood, hands easy, eyes mean. The snow had swallowed their tracks until they seemed to float. "Last ask," Cyrus said. The switch balanced across his palm like a promise. "Girl comes with me. She'll be housed, fed, taught manners. You keep the coin for your trouble." Amos carried the axe the way a preacher carries a Bible, both tool and conviction. He'd sharpened it by lantern light until the edge would split a hair on a stump. His jacket was canvas, frayed at the cuffs, and his hat a sweat-stained felt, shadowed eyes that had counted more tree rings than birthdays in the last decade. He stepped off the porch with the careful weight of a man who knows ground can lie. "No," he said. It left his mouth simple, unadorned, like a gravestone with only a name. The barrel-built man took one pace forward. His breath smoked a ghost above his lip. "You ain't the law." "Neither are you," Amos said. "Guns left leather." Metal spoke in the thin air with clicks and sighs, and the low, hungry whispers of actions being drawn back. The river clapped its water hands in applause no one wanted. "On three," Cyrus said as if setting a dance. The first shot came from the house. Eliza, arm steady though her heart wove wild rugs in her chest, fired through the low window at the snow between Cyrus's boots. The blast turned white ground red-brown with dirt. Men flinched. Horses skittered. The second barrel boomed a heartbeat later, shredding the switch from Cyrus's fist and sending splinters into his sleeve. Amos moved like a man who had waited all winter for an avalanche to finally let go. He threw the axe, not to kill but to count, and it sank into the cottonwood inches from the lazy-eyed man's ear. The shock stole everyone's breath, the trees, the men's, the rivers. Guns barked. A bullet kissed Amos's shoulder and burned a line through canvas and skin, a firebrand that wrote pain up his neck. He staggered, saw stars, and tasted copper. But he did not fall. He lifted the fallen shotgun from the porch, worked the action with a smooth motion born of a lumberjack's rhythm, and leveled it at knees like he'd told Eliza. Cyrus's mouth thinned to a paper cut. "You just bought yourself a war," he said. The barrel-built man rushed the porch. Amos fired. Pellets chewed bark off the post and bit the man's thigh. He howled, fell, crawled backward, leaving a worming trail. The lazy-eyed one fired back. Window glass screamed and fell in glittering tears. Eliza crouched, hands over the child. Breath counted in sevens like her mother taught her to keep panic from stealing thoughts. Cyrus used the noise like a cloak, slipping to the side, making for the porch steps where the lantern hung. He snatched it, yanked the cap, and flame leaped like a trapped fox. He smiled, finally thunder, not rain, ready to hurl it at the door. "Eliza!" Amos shouted. Not instruction, not plea, but the sound of two lives making a hinge. She rose in a single clean motion, a piece of ribbon-blessed courage. The poker from the stove lay by the hearth. She grabbed it, rushed the door, and swatted the lantern from Cyrus's grip. There flipped, spilled fire like liquid sunrise across snow, and crawled up the cottonwood's bark, eating the air with a greedy hiss. Smoke twisted. Horses reared. The river gossiped louder, as if to one-up the flames. Amos charged. His wounded shoulder sang a black hymn, but he threw it into Cyrus's chest and drove him backward off the porch. They hit the snow hard. Cyrus's hand scrabbled for a knife, Amos's hand found the front of his coat and a fistful of winter. "Eliza, run!" Amos said, and she did. Out the side through willow thickets bowed under ice, boots crunching, breath steaming, child held with one arm as the other knocked branches aside. Shots popped like corn. The world narrowed to rivers and fire, and men whose names would end today, one way or another. The cottonwood was a column of flame now, heat pounding against skin like fists. Amos's axe still quivered in the trunk, blade bright as a fresh tooth. Cyrus dragged Amos toward the heat, toward a fate he thought would cleanse all debts. "We all burn in the end," he whispered, eyes delighted as a child's at a magic trick. Amos drove his forehead into Cyrus's nose. Bone cracked like thin ice. Blood poured. The switch, what was left of it, lay in the snow, smoke curling from its splinters. Amos grabbed it, snapped it the rest of the way, and threw the two halves into the fire. He turned for Eliza, saw only snow, willow ghosts, and the river's steam. Then, in the smoke stutter, a shape at the bend. Two riders, fresh, closing fast. With the cottonwood burning like a beacon and fresh guns coming, how do you protect a woman who runs for two? The two riders cut across the shale like skaters, snow spitting from hooves. One wore a deputy's star tarnished down to a faint memory. The other wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Cyrus, blood on his lip and smoke crowning his head, shouted and pointed toward the willows. "Through there." Amos limped to the porch, reloaded with hands that shook only after the shells slid home. The wound throbbed a hot pulse in his shoulder. He knew this dance, the part where exhaustion wants to sit and grief wants to lie down. Instead, he breathed in the smell of wet ash and pine, felt the ash handle of the axe as he yanked it free from the burning tree, and ran. Eliza crashed through willows until branches let go of her dress's threads like old beggars. The river was a grey snake beside her, fast and cold. She reached the little footbridge, a log hewn flat and iced slick as glass. The baby kicked, impatient. "Hush," she whispered, "we're nearly." A bullet bit the log by her foot. Wood screamed and spat splinters. She slid, caught herself with one hand, ribbon flashing blue against winter white. Behind her, the deputy starman laughed. "Careful now," he called, voice bright as a polished coffin. "Road's slippery when you carry too much." Eliza turned. "So you carry nothing," she said, and the words surprised her by how steady they sounded. The man with the fake smile reined up. "Orders are orders, miss. Cyrus wants you back. Says that child's his blood." Eliza lifted her chin. "Blood is what you spill. Family is who keeps you from freezing." Amos came down the slope, boots digging in, axe balanced, shotgun slung. His breath fogged ornate curses into the air. He put himself between Eliza and the riders without measuring the odds. The deputy starman looked at him, at the axe, at the girl's ribboned wrist, at the way Amos made the air feel heavier just by standing. "That shoulder looks bad," he observed. "Better than your conscience," Amos said. The man with the smile drew. Amos moved first, an arc of ash wood and steel kissing the man's wrist. The gun spilled into the snow with a muffled thunk. The deputy starman fired and clipped Amos's hat. Felt grazed hair, the sting like a wasp with a grudge. Eliza used the moment. She stepped onto the bridge, planted her boots like pegs, and leveled the shotgun. "Legs don't lie," she said, and fired. The deputy went down, both knees bent wrong, shock turning his face into a child's. The other man, clutching his bleeding wrist, backed his horse. Cyrus, limping, smoke-stained, came puffing through the willows too late and too loud, knife bright and twitching in his hand. It ended not with a bellow but with a sentence. Amos took one pace forward and said, "No more." Cyrus lunged, rage a blindfold. Amos turned the knife with his forearm and brought the axe handle across Cyrus's temple, with a flat final sound like a door closing. Cyrus staggered, knees buckled, eyes lost their cruel little lights. He fell into the snow beside the river, knife leafing from his hand to the current's mouth. The river took it away without asking names. Silence returned on fox feet. The cottonwood down valley finished its song in a hiss and a crack, fell in a blaze that sighed out with a last woof. Amos stood panting, smoke and snow warring in his lungs. Eliza leaned against the bridge rail, the shotgun heavy now, ribbon catching a breath of wind like a soft flag. They tied wounds with strips of shirt and rope. They took the deputy's star, rubbed the tarnish until it gave them a name from a town far off, a man who'd run from law to sell it second-hand to cruelty. They put Cyrus on his horse, hands bound, head lolling, and led him to town, where a crowd had gathered at the bell's last dull echoes. In front of the livery, back where the rope first creaked and the lantern lied, Amos told the story plain. Men looked at their boots. Women looked at Eliza's face and saw something grow there, a fierceness without venom. The town's marshal, who had been a good man too slow, took Cyrus into a cell that had been empty too long. He didn't promise justice. He promised chain and time, and for once that seemed like a path that walked forward. Weeks turned into a ledger of small mercies. Amos's shoulder healed to a ropey line of pride. The cabin grew used to 2 breaths instead of 1. Eliza's laugh found its way through the rooms like a sparrow testing windows. When the baby came, a boy with hair like river-sanded straw and lungs like a church bell, it was in the quiet hour before dawn, with snow whispering at the door and the stove ticking like an old clock. Amos caught the child in hands that had felled trees and failed at nothing more important, and he cried without shame, tears hissing when they hit the stove's iron. "What name?" Eliza asked later, exhausted, bright ribbon tied around her wrist and her son's ankle both. A little blue promise doubled. Amos looked at the tiny fist, at the ridges of Eliza's smile, at the smoke curling in the cabin's lantern light. He thought of ledgers and of debts that weren't his, and of a river that carried away knives like it was sweeping a floor after a bad story. "Not mine," he said. "Not his, ours." They called him River, because he came when he was ready, and changed the shape of things he touched. Cyrus Bledsoe went to trial and then to road gang and then, as men like him do, to a small place where the world is reduced to a bunk, a fence and the memories you can't outrun. The deputy starman left town with his knees bound and his pride whittled to a toothpick. The man with the smile bought a ticket east and learned to use his left hand for everything, including making a living without the right. Amos and Eliza built the rest like a cabin, beam by beam, mistakes sanded smooth, edges planned until the hand could slide along without catching. He taught River to listen to the ropes creak, and the boots crunch and the lanterns hiss as languages that tell you what night plans. She taught River that names aren't debts, and family is the shelter you choose to keep, not the cage you're handed. And when spring came and the cottonwood sprouted green from blackened bark, because some trees are too stubborn to take fire personally, they stood under it with River in their arms and understood what the West sometimes gives, not riches, not peace, but a chance to put a different ending on a story that started with a bell. If you were in Eliza's place, sold in a room where even light seemed to hitch, is there a moment when you would have run, or would you have stayed to fight beside a stranger with a scar and a code? Like this story and subscribe for the next Wild West tale. And if you want to see how the next battle unfolds, don't miss the next story. Subscribe now.